Hi, it's your $2 Tuesday movie critic here today with another movie. Today I'm going to be reviewing the movie Get On Up. Now this is a drama slash biopic of the iconic entertainer James Brown. This movie discusses mainly his professional life, but it also gives some background on his personal life on when he started out. The thing about this movie is that it's more of a documentary than a drama, and I say that because it gives more facts about his professional life, and then it gives little snippets of his personal life and how he grew up and his life when he was a young boy, as a teenager, and then as a young man, and then growing up in the business. But it mainly talks about how these things affected him as an entertainer, and it's the way it does it as well, which I found really, really great, was that it doesn't go in the chronological order. It starts actually when he's doing one of his performances, and then it kind of goes back and forth in between when he began when he was a child in Georgia, and then it goes to when he was a teen, and it comes back again to when he's an adult, and then it goes on and on like that. It brings different snippets, like I said. And I think the reason that they did this was they wanted to show how those past occurrences affected him as an adult entertainer. Full disclosure, I am not a big James Brown fan. I'm not really a James Brown fan at all. This was like one of those movies I wasn't in a hurry to see, even though a lot of people I knew were, and I wanted to, I didn't want to see it. It's just, in the summer, I'm all about the action movies, if you couldn't tell by my reviews. The movie gets you to see how soulful James Brown really is. Because more of his music as he got older, like in the 80s and the 90s, was more like commercialized, in my opinion. But his music when he was first starting out, that's, I'm sure, where he got his name, the Godfather of Soul, from. Because it is so soulful. And you can hear the emotions coming from his voice and the raspiness of it when he's singing. It's amazing, And it also shows the encounter, his first encounter with the Rolling Stones when he had to open for them. And he pretty much brought the house down and was like, okay, try following that. And, of course, they were in great awe of him. And for those of you that may not know, Mick Jagger was the leading force in producing this movie and bringing it to fruition. And he was a huge fan of James Brown. And that was one of the things, too, about James Brown. He was one of the pioneers of this type of music. I mean, of soul music, for sure. And, he's the icon that other icons look up to, like Michael Jackson, a lot of rock and rollers like Mick Jagger, things like that. These people really looked up to him and still do. He's an electric entertainer. He can move, he could dance. He was very prideful of his race, and and the voice, you can't get past the voice. And the conviction, he was such a perfectionist in his art and for the people that worked with him. And you get to see that a lot in the movie, where these guys honestly admitted they were with James Brown because he paid them to be there. But none of them really cared too much for him except his best friend Bobby. And you see that a lot in the movie, where James Brown is not really a nice guy. He pretty much, those people that care about him end up probably wishing they didn't care about him, because he only cares about himself. And it has a lot to do with his upbringing, where, the people that were supposed to love him and protect him and care for him the most abandoned him. And, he spent a lot of time fending for himself, getting help along the way. But even that, somehow he made it out to be he never had any help. No one ever helped him. He did everything on his own. Which, if you look back if you look at the movie, you see that that is not necessarily the case. Not always. He had help. It probably wasn't the best help in the world, but those people did help him out a bit on his way. So, I liked the movie. I really did. There wasn't anything that I didn't like about the movie. I liked the fact that it was a biopic instead of just like all straightened out drama, because James Brown, the artist, was a very serious person. He was very technical, and everything he did, everything had to be a certain way, and he was a huge control freak, just looking at the movie and telling his story. So, you know, the movie had to have that same type of tone, or, you know, you wouldn't feel that it had anything to do with James Brown. So this was a good movie for that, and I appreciated that. I think that the people that had a hand in producing it, like the Rolling Stones, and directing it, and then Chadwick Boseman, who was the man that portrayed James Brown in this movie, he did an excellent job. You know, you got lost in the fact that this was an actor playing James Brown and just felt like he was James Brown. He actually had a very good resemblance to James Brown, and the moves, it was great. And the movie also starred Nelson Ellis, who played James Brown's best friend Bobby, and then Dan Aykroyd, who was James Brown's manager, Viola Davis, who was James Brown's mother in the picture. So it was a very great cast. This cast was excellent, and they did a great job of portraying the story of James Brown in such a way that it wasn't just a drama, it was definitely a docu-drama. And it did deal more, like I said, more about his professional life than his personal life, but they did put a bit of they did add snippets of his personal life in there, because you wouldn't have a biography without having that portion of his life. And it was done really, really well. So I would suggest it to anybody that wanted to see it. Of course, it is definitely a movie that should be more for your teens to adults than the younger kids. The music itself, they did a lot of his songs in there, and great job with the songs, and they did a lot of his older classics, which I very much appreciated, because these were the songs that were the essential James Brown singles and classics, as opposed to, like I said, the songs that came out later on in his life, like in the 80s and beyond, which honestly I believe were more commercialized. And then, you know, they wonder, if you watch this movie, you will have no question about why James Brown is considered the godfather of soul. Let's just say that. So I suggest it to anyone that wants to know more about James Brown, and that loves James Brown's music, and that is a James Brown fan. And even those that are not necessarily a James Brown fan like me, but are interested in his story. I love a good story, so you will definitely love this movie, because it's a good story. It's more document based than drama, but it's not dry. It's not a dry documentary. It has a drama in there too. It's just not over embellished. So there is a lot of curse words in here. It's not too over the top, and you know, it's not salacious or anything like that, but they are there. There is violence in the movie, not too much. It's mostly him singing and performing and being with his band, and even in some parts of it being with his family. But there is violence. That was a huge part of his life, unfortunately. So there's a lot of violence. Well, not a lot, but there is more than a little violence. I'll say that, because violence, like I said, is a part of his life, and so that's there. So I would suggest it for 17 and above age range. So I would recommend it to anybody that wants to see a good movie about a musical icon. The old school movies that I chose to compare to Get On Up are two movies also about icons. Now, the first movie is about Little Richard, and it's called actually Little Richard, and it came out in 2000. So just at the new millennium. Now the reason I chose Little Richard was for two reasons. One was in the movie Get On Up, there is a conversation between Little Richard and James Brown, where Little Richard tells James Brown how he needs to get out there, get his name out there, and become famous. Because before he meets Little Richard, James is playing at juke joints around town and stuff, but he doesn't really have a label, and he doesn't have any money really. So Little Richard tells him what he needs to do in order to make it big, or you start at the beginning to do that. The conversation itself was very, it was almost intense. And of course it shows the flamboyance of Little Richard, but not too over the top. And so, but you see it. And that was one of the things and it made me think of the movie Little Richard. Now the movie Little Richard, it was only on television. It wasn't in the movie theaters. This was definitely drama. It was a melodrama. So, and it, like I said, it came out in 2000. It was starring Leon, who played Little Richard, Jennifer Lewis, who played his mom, Carl Lumbly, who played his dad, and Tamala Jones, who played Lucille, his girlfriend slash friend. The movie was over-the-top melodrama. And, of course, again, it fits the entertainer, because if you've ever seen Little Richard perform, I've only seen him perform on television. I've never seen him perform live. But he is over the top. I mean, he had embellishment to the T. And, you know, his performances, whether he's acting or whether he's singing and dancing and stuff, just over the top. Little Richard is what some consider the architect of rock and roll, because he started doing rock and roll music before there was a such thing as rock and roll music. He made it famous. Now, yeah, there could have been people that sang rock and roll before Little Richard, but he was the one that made it famous. He was the one that was out there doing it that everyone began to copy. I have to say, I do love Little Richard's music, because it's that type of music that just makes you want to get up and dance and just feel good. You have to at least smile when you hear a Little Richard song, because they all have that huge thing. Because before Little Richard's music, there was bebop, there was doo-wop, there was crooning, but there was no rock and roll. Nobody was doing rock and roll then. And I don't know that because I was there. It's just like if you go back and look at pre-Little Richard, and then, of course, post-Little Richard, there's rock and roll all over the place. And let's not get rock and roll mixed up with rock. Rock and roll is different from rock. Even though rock came from rock and roll, two different genres. But yeah, the rock and roll helped to birth rock into what it is today. But when you think it's two different genres still, it's like rock and roll is the dad of rock. And it's great, and Little Richard helped to put it there. And a lot of people don't give him credit for it. In some cases, some people don't even consider him an icon, even though he's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And like I said, he's one of the pioneers of the music. So, and one of the reasons it is because of, I think, because of Little Richard's flamboyance. People never really took him seriously, even though his music, you couldn't deny how great it was. But his flamboyance and the way he carried himself and the way he looked, the way he dressed, people really did not like that part of him, especially during that time. Now he's embraced for that. But back then, at that time, his father hated him, or I should not say hated him, but his father really hated the person that he personified with the way he was. He said when he was little, he used to dress up in the little girl's clothing. And of course, you know, his dad would beat him for it, and they show that in the movie. But it was like Little Richard had to be true to himself, and the older he got, the more truthful he was with that image. So that was one of the movies. Like I said, it was a television movie. It was a really good movie. And the reason I got that was because he was also a musical icon just like James Brown, even though their music was, for the most part, very different. James Brown's music was more soulful and funk, and Little Richard's music was rock and roll all the way. And then, of course, later on, he went and did some gospel songs. They both did, actually. James Brown and Little Richard did gospel songs, and Little Richard, I think probably for different reasons. Little Richard always said that he always battled with the fact that he grew up in the church. He wanted to please God. He wanted to please his family, but he also wanted to be true to himself. And it was like a battle within himself. So he went back and forth with secular and gospel music until he finally decided that secular music, if used for good, can still be a good thing and doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. So, and there you have it. And then the other movie, old school movie, was the movie Ali. And this came out in 2001. This starred Will Smith, Jamie Foxx, Jon Voight, and Jada Pinkett Smith. Now, this movie was more, and the reason I compared the two was because this movie, Ali, was a docudrama just like the movie Get On Up was a docudrama. I think Ali was actually even more of a docudrama, meaning it was more of a documentary than it was actually a drama. And I think when a lot of people, including myself, when we went to see it, we expected to see a drama, you know, and it wasn't. It was more of a documentary, and it was almost kind of dry, a dry documentary. It had its dramatic moments in there, but it was a good film. It was a good film, but because most people were expecting a drama, it was a bit disappointing. I had to watch it. I have to admit, I had to watch it a couple of times before I decided that I liked it. And I actually bought it on VHS. So, but it tells the story of Muhammad Ali when he was initially Cassius Clay. But again, it tells more about his professional life. And then when it talks about his personal life, it shows how his personal life affected his professional life, like when he decided that he wasn't going to go to Vietnam and his title was taken away from him, and then of course when he changed his name from Cassius Clay to Muhammad Ali after joining the Nation of Islam. And it also shows the relationship that he had with Malcolm X, which I thought was really great, because before that I didn't even know they had a relationship together, even though they were both with the Nation of Islam. You learn so much more about Muhammad Ali because he was a beautiful man and very charismatic, and he had it even goes over the relationship that he had with Howard Cosell. And you know, before that I never realized how personable they were with each other, but they were, and you get to see how his charisma didn't just go for the women, which he admitted he loved women, and you can tell it there in the movie, but also the charisma of just a person being very personable with people, and still at the same time having a huge ego, which he did have, and but people liked him, and people were drawn to him. And the movie shows that, and you don't necessarily, it doesn't say this is why, it just shows him as a person, and you know how he in some ways was very, very simple, but in other ways very complex and very torn throughout his life with the things that happened to him, you know, and the things that were happening to him. So I really enjoyed this movie. And, you know, it's just one of those movies. Like I said, I ended up buying it, and then after watching it a couple more times, I didn't necessarily enjoy it the first time I watched it, because, like I said, I expected it to be a drama. But after I watched it a couple more times, I really did like it. So that's another movie that I recommend. These are my movie reviews for today. I hope you like them. If there's another movie that you think better compares to Get On Up, please let me know at the bottom of the screen. And until next time, I'll see you later.